Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Daniel Horan, and I'm professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology. And I have the distinct privilege of serving as the director of the Center for the Study of Spirituality here at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana. I am absolutely delighted to welcome you this evening to our panel. But before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to say a word about the center, and in a special way to remember the founding director of the center, Dr. Keith Egan, who, after 94 years, entered eternal life just 2 weeks ago. Founded in 1984 by Dr. Keith Egan, with the support from the Sisters of the Holy Cross and St. Mary's College, the Center for the Study of Spirituality was founded and offers programs that promote the engagement between faith and reason and the connection between mind, body, and spirit. As an academic center, it is a hub for scholarly and public engagement, which draws on intellectual resources in the Catholic and broader Christian tradition, as well as how individuals practice faith in their daily lives to develop critical conversations around contemporary religious issues, especially as they relate to women's experiences in society, the academy, and the church. This academic year, we are celebrating the 40th anniversary of the center, as well as the 40th anniversary of the annual Madeleva Lecture. This lecture, which features prominent women scholars in the fields of theology, history, and spirituality, was part of the original vision for the work of the center that Dr. Egan had proposed to the Board of Trustees of the college in 1984. Each of these important lectures has also been published as a small book by Paulus Press, a tradition that we're proud continues to this day. As part of the celebration year, we have convened 3 panels of previous Madeleva lecturers. This evening is the third and final of our 3 facilitated discussions with our esteemed Madeleva Lecture alumnae. It is my pleasure now to introduce my colleague, Dr. Julia Fetter, the Assistant Director at the Center and Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Theology, who will introduce our honored guests and host our event this evening. Julia.
I'm so happy to be with these wonderful panelists tonight. I have the great privilege of introducing them. We'll start with Dr. Gail Porter Mandell, who is the professor and Schlesinger Chair of Humanistic Studies Emerita at St. Mary's College. She has authored numerous essays on Sister Madeleva Wolff, and her books include Madeleva, a Biography, Angel Creek, Where the River Meets the Sea, Life into Art, Conversations with 7 Contemporary Biographers, and The Phoenix Paradox, a study of renewal through change in the collected poems and last poems of D.H. Lawrence. We also have with us Dr. Mary Ann Hinsdale, a member of the Sisters Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary in Monroe, Michigan, and is an Emerita Professor of Theology at Boston College. A former president of the Catholic Theological Society of America, she is the co-editor of the T&T Clark Handbook on Theological Anthropology and Faith That Transforms, Essays in Honor of Gregory Baum, and co-author of It Comes from the People, Community Development and Local Theologies, and the author of many articles and book chapters on Mary Magdalene, theological anthropology, feminist and ecological theologies. Dr. Susan A. Ross is retired from Loyola University of Chicago in 2019 after 39 years of teaching and administration, including at St. Norbert College and Duquesne University. She received her BA from Manhattanville College and her MA and PhD from the University of Chicago. She is the author of 3 books and over 100 articles, book chapters, and reviews, and has lectured widely in the United States and abroad. She is a member of the editorial board of Theological Studies, a past director of the international journal Concilium, a past president of the Catholic Theological Society of America, and currently serves on the boards of 3 Chicago area nonprofit groups. Welcome to all 3 of our distinguished panelists.
Good to be here.
I'm wondering if we could start off our conversation with you, Dr. Mandell. You delivered the Madeleva Lecture in 1994, so 31 years ago. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you addressed in your lecture and maybe how your thinking has developed since then.
Thank you, Julia, and good evening, everyone, wherever you are. I'm in South Bend, Indiana. It is very cold, it is very snowy, and it's beautiful as always. I'll begin with, if I may, with a confession. I was a reluctant Madeleva lecturer. Not that I wasn't honored to be invited, but I am not a theologian. My field is English language and literature. So at first, I actually said no. But then I reconsidered. A little pressure from Keith Egan, who was director of the center at the time, and dear Sister Rachel Callahan, a member of the Sisters of the Holy Cross. But why did I change my mind? Well, in 1994, the year that I gave the lecture, Madeleva, who was once acclaimed as the most renowned nun in the world, had been dead for 30 years, and her many achievements had faded from public memory. 1994 was the 10th anniversary of the Madeleva Lecture series and the 150th anniversary of the founding of St. Mary's, in which Sister Madeleva played so large a part. And so I was convinced that it was an appropriate time to tell her story, even if I might be stealing my own thunder, because I was at the time writing a full-length biography of Sister Madeleva's life. My first draft of the lecture was about writing the biography, but I decided too much about me, and I tossed it in the waste can. Instead, I told her story by emphasizing her roles as a poet, as a medieval scholar, as an educator, and as a religious sister. I thought I might be stealing my own thunder because I was at the time in the process of writing a full-length biography of her life. My sense of the story that I told was that I wasn't focusing on one individual person's life. I was really trying to look at women's lives in general through her, but it was not how she represented all women, but I wanted to emphasize how her achievements challenged the stereotypes of women of her day, especially of nuns. And I wanted to suggest, as Sister Ann Hinsdale did later in her Madeleva lecture, that each woman has a unique story to tell. And that is how we discover and define ourselves, by telling our stories and hearing those of others, one woman's life at a time. What appealed to me about Madeleva's life, and it still does, is her what I would call quixotic attempt to reclaim and reinterpret and adapt ancient truths to her own time. She embraced the modern world without abandoning her religious faith or the institutions that shaped and supported it. In retrospect, looking at the church and the world today, I think I underestimated her significance, especially in regard how she worked within the system to improve the status of women in the church, something we're still working on, as this synod on synodality shows. I rectified some of that underestimation in the biography published in 1997, but there are many of her achievements that still call for exploration and development. For example, what she called the apostolate of beauty, really an ethic of beauty. The way she put it was, and I think of you, Susan, here in your lovely lecture on beauty and sacramentality. And she really, in her words, which she had adopted from certain others, she talked about beauty as God's visibility. And she said, made this incredible claim that if you have beauty, and if you take care of beauty, truth and goodness will take care of themselves, which is really, I hope you have something to say about that, Susan.
I do.
And the other was what I would call her spirituality. I mean, she had this personified notion of holy indifference or detachment, which can seem so cold and so impersonal, as the relaxed grasp, the ability to let go when the time came. And I really think that that is something that we should all, I mean, it just seems to me a marvelous motto for how to live one's life. And the other was her whole idea of the sacrament of the present moment, a way of encountering God in the here and now through the tangible. For example, through nature and human relationships. Also, the way she integrated what she called her three lives: her human, her professional, and religious or spiritual life. So that's how I thought about my topic back then, and sort of how I'm thinking about it now.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I wonder, Dr. Hinsdale, if you might tell us a little bit about your lecture, 2004, 21 years ago, and how you think about it now.
Well, of course, it was entitled Women Shaping Theology. And thank you, Gail, for bringing up the idea of my idea of wanting to tell a story. When the reason why I chose the title, I think is important. I was teaching at the College of the Holy Cross then. And when I first started there, I had come from teaching 5 years in a seminary. So it was quite a change from going from, it was a wonderfully progressive seminary, which is why it doesn't exist anymore, I hate to say. But anyway, I talk about that in the lecture. I had a sophomore boy, a young man, I should say, not a boy, who said to me at the very beginning of a semester, came up and he said, I didn't know nuns could teach in college. And I said, really? Well, here you know one now. And he said, I just thought they taught in grade school. So I thought, oh my gosh, that seems so kind of obvious to me. But then I also thought of my own experience being a person in college myself. And of course, it was a women's college, and I did have women professors. But when I went to graduate school, I only had one woman professor in graduate school during the time that I was at the University of St. Michael's College, and that was in the late 70s and early 80s. So I thought, wow, a lot has changed, because here I am with a doctorate teaching these undergraduates, and then eventually I went on to Boston College and taught graduate students. So that was kind of in my mind. And as I started to research about, well, how did women get into theology and so forth, I obviously already knew about Sister Madeleva's School of Theology because the woman who it was an important mentor in my life, Margaret Brennan, Sister Margaret Brennan, had gotten her theology degree from St. Mary's in the school that Sister Madeleva set up. I also had Dr. Joanne Walsky-Kahn as a professor in my undergraduate, where we still had a formation campus college of Marygrove College where I went. And I thought, well, how do I go about doing this? And I thought, I think there's really a backstory to all of this. Uh, and that is the whole idea of women's colleges, for example, which are now going the way of all flesh, I gather, except for St. Mary's. And this backstory was the sister formation movement. And I knew none of my students would know what that is. So I started researching that and thinking about how that really prepared women in general, basically, to become teachers and especially for women religious, not to step foot in the classroom until they actually had a degree. And so many of my students wouldn't have known that, for example, the caricatures that they make of sisters throwing erasers at students that are unruly or whatever. A lot of that was because first of all, the elementary school classes were so large, 75 kids in one of my elementary school classes at a Catholic school. And some of the early sisters who taught were just out of the novitiate, 19, 20 years old. I don't know what I would have done with 75, first or second graders if they started, getting out of hand. I don't think I would throw an eraser at them, but I think I would become very frustrated. And so I think that probably led to a lot of these stories about these nuns who really brought havoc on students. So anyway, I realized that my own life actually patterned some of these events that I think were important in the backstory for women shaping theology. In other words, that I was educated by sisters who were products of the sister formation movement, having gotten their degrees before they sat into a classroom, who had advanced degrees, particularly the IHMs were very well educated. I always like to say, since some of you who have seen last time's Madeleva Lectures, Reflections, I had Sister Sandra Schneider's in high school. I didn't actually have her for class, but she taught in my high school. So that was, kind of a really unusual thing. And I remember my classmates would say, people can't believe that I actually had Sandra Schneider's when I was a sophomore in high school. So anyway, that's where she started. So those were some of the things that were important to me, that to somehow, both as a woman religious, but as a woman, period, to kind of tell a story about there was a time when you didn't have women teaching theology in colleges. And so that was kind of the motivation for me to sort of tell that story. And then just a little anecdote. I was already at Boston College when I was writing this, even though the impetus for doing the topic came from that undergraduate at Holy Cross. And I had a visiting professorship at the University of Dayton, and they gave me an apartment to live in. And in the apartment was actually a former graduate student friend of mine, a man, a theologian, a good friend. But I invited him down for supper one night because he actually was commuting. His wife was in Maryland, and he was also there on a sabbatical for the semester. And I was telling him what I was going to do, and say, well, this was my life story and the story of women getting into theology. And he said, don't you think that's rather self-indulgent to kind of tell your own story? And I thought, oh, well, yeah, I guess so. And so that little, you know, um, person sat on my shoulder the whole time I was writing this story. And I still have always been a little bit kind of embarrassed about it, but that didn't keep me from actually using it in one of my feminist theology and theories class, although I actually bought students the book. I didn't make them pay for it. And I would wait until Paulus Press would have their bargain catalog and buy about 15 copies of it so that I could give them for free. So that's kind of a little bit of the background about why I chose the topic, and I can say more later about what I might do differently today.
Well, that's such an interesting segue. Dr. Ross, I wonder if you might talk about your lecture. I can see some themes of self-indulgence maybe being an interesting connection point.
Well, my lecture was on the relationship between women, beauty, and justice. And so some background, I guess, I actually started out in college as a music major, and I wanted to be a professional pianist, but I realized pretty early on that, I could play pretty well, but not certainly that well. And so I became a religion major. And I have to say, in relation to what Marianne was just saying, my inspiration for becoming a religion major in college was really one of the nuns that taught me. And like you, I had some very highly educated women religious at my college. And so this love of music and the love of the arts has been something that's been a part of my life. And so I had written my dissertation on the relationship between the arts and revelation, which is basically, how do we come to know God? How does God reveal who God is to us? And so much of theology has to do with concepts and ideas and abstract thought. And my sense was that how God comes to us is not just in these abstract ideas, but in beauty and works of art, in the world, in the sacramentality of the world. And so after I did my dissertation, I was beginning to learn about feminist theology, which was still relatively new in the late 70s and early 80s when I started teaching. And I gradually came to see that many of the ways that women approach theology came from a kind of an aesthetic dimension, that it wasn't always abstract ideas, but that it was almost always, in some way through experiences. So when I was asked to do the Madeleva Lecture, I wasn't given an assignment, which was nice. I could just choose what I wanted to do. And so I chose this idea of beauty and justice. And at the same time, the whole field of what is now called theological aesthetics had really kind of become very popular in the area of theology. And a theologian that I actually worked on in my dissertation, Hans Urs von Balthasar, he was sort of the big name in all of it. And in many ways, he has a lot of wonderful things to say, but his ideas of gender are terrible. His idea of gender is basically women are icons of beauty, women are symbols of beauty, but the idea that women have something themselves to say as subjects of beauty is something altogether different. So I thought that I would do this, and so the lecture itself, in the little book itself, looked at beauty from 3 different angles. The first was a kind of a personal sense and how we look at it in nature, which is that beauty is something that we encounter in our lives in many different ways. And in fact, beauty has a role in nature, but also the ways that women have been seen to kind of embody beauty, not in a very positive way. They're sort of either set apart, or that beauty is something very trivial, that women, they worry about fashion or they worry about home design, and they're not, beauty isn't anything important. And then the second part of it, I talked about beauty in churches and in the ways that women live their lives in a religious context. And it was very interesting that some of the early Christian fathers would say that women are tempting to men. And so men have to be very careful around women, that women should not dress nicely because they would tempt the men, and that in fact women weren't allowed to sing in church choirs because their voices would tempt men. Women were not allowed to handle altar vessels. All of these things, these are women's understanding of beauty as a threat. And then the third part of the lecture, I looked at the ways in which women in the world are trying to live lives of both beauty and justice. And I use some examples of African women and the ways in which their very practical lives, their homes, their work was not simply a way to make money, but it was also a way to make the world more beautiful. And then I would also say that in terms of theories of ethics, and what I tried to bring together in terms of theories of justice here, was that so often when we talk about being good or doing good, we talk about it in terms of obligation and duty. And it seems very, very difficult and very, very hard to do. But that in fact, I think when we want to do good, and this is what Gail was saying a little bit earlier, where beauty, truth, and justice come together, that beauty itself encourages us and calls to us to be truthful, to be beautiful, to be good. And so that all of the ways in which we encounter the world should be ways in which we're more generous with beauty, in which we can share the beauty of the world rather than seeing it as something, something simply to possess. So in fact, a couple of years ago, this is probably 10 years after I did the Madeleva Lecture, I did some research on women religious and the ways in which women religious nuns used beauty in a way to educate their students in justice. And it was really interesting to see what various religious orders have done in terms of making sure that their college buildings were beautiful. This you can see in St. Catherine's in Minnesota, and at Mundelein College, which became part of Loyola University, and how their understanding was that beauty really ought to be for everyone, and that a beautiful world is also a more just world. So, so I think that says a little bit about the kind of approach that I had. I'm still interested in the ways that we try and approach questions of truth and of goodness, not simply as, something very dutiful and serious, but something that's also, in a sense, joyful and beautiful.
Thank you. I'm really struck in your comments about women's liturgical participation, that beauty is seen as a threat. So the invitational quality of beauty is something that's scary if a woman is at the altar, or if a woman is touching these liturgical components.
And I think that's still true. I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of that, the thought of a woman in liturgical vestments, for some people, it's just horrible. And it's almost blasphemous that there's something about how the divine appears, that if it's associated with women, then it seems to get associated with sexuality. And sexuality and God, of course, cannot come together, because while God is beyond sex, God is male. And so to talk about the beauty of God, in some ways, just it has traditionally kept women very much out of the picture.
I wonder if there's any connection, Dr. Mandell, that you see here with this. I'm thinking about Sister Madeleva as a poet.
Yeah.
Talked so much about the attractiveness of God, in sensual terms. I wonder if you had a comment about this.
Yes, absolutely. I think Sister Madeleva was condemned by many of her readers, many of whom were from the clergy, for the erotic nature of her poetry. And she wrote poems that remind me very much of the Song of Songs, of some of St. Teresa's, of Avila's poetry, John of the Cross. I mean, it's a very erotic and sensual and sexual explosion of union with the divine. And I find that poetry still scalping, as Emily Dickinson might say, poems that is really good scalps you. It really takes away, your mind is gone and your whole body isn't involved. And her poetry does that to me. I realize, I mean, she's been described as a first-rate, second-rate poet, but she is in many ways defined by her age and by the kind of poetry that shaped her, which came out of that English period from the early part of the 20th century of converts who were writing wonderful poetry and all very spiritual and all very sensual. And I love to read her poetry because it reminds me of the incarnation and the incarnational God. And I think too often we lose touch with that, and it leads us into all kinds of aberrations of our own sexuality. So if there are any students writing, run to the library and check out any of her poetry, Knights Errant, Penelope. She wrote some wonderful poems about all the harlots in the Old Testament who are loved by God. I mean, she is quite, and Penelope, she identifies with in times of spiritual dryness, where is this lover God? And it was wonderful to watch, as I read through all her poetry, see her as a young woman passionately in love with God, moving through a mature stage where she felt abandoned by her lover, and then finding God again in the child, in which enabled her to nurture the young and turn into a mother herself instead of being the bride of Christ or the lover of Christ.
Yeah. Oh, interesting.
Since we're talking about sexuality and beauty, eroticism, I'm thinking about this idea that you brought up, Marianne, about the self-indulgent. I see this as a theme that each of you is sort of playing with and upsetting our notions about what counts as self-indulgent. I wonder if you wanted to say anything more about that, Dr. Hinsdale.
Well, I think actually what I kind of was trying to get at was what sometimes people call imposter syndrome or something like that. That I was afraid using my own life and my own experiences, was sort of illegitimate, and that kind of self-critique that I think often women fall into. But with regard to self-indulgence, this is a different way of thinking. I think what I've most appreciated about being a theologian is the mentoring that I was given. And I was just thinking about my heroes, who I cite them a little bit in my lecture, were Rosemary Radford Ruther. She was the first feminist theologian that I ever heard speak. It was up in Toronto. And then Gregory Baum, who ended up being my dissertation director, who both of them were sort of fearless. And the third is, it was mentioned, one of the book that I co-wrote, really, it comes from the people, Community Development and Local Theology, was the time that I spent in Appalachia, over 5 years worth writing that book with a woman named Helen Lewis, who had been at the Highlander Center in Newmarket, Tennessee, which is where a lot of the civil rights people really got their training and so forth. And she taught me something which I kind of think I've tried to do, but that is, she never went to a conference without bringing a student with her. Mm-hmm. And I thought, now, and I haven't done that to all of the CTSA conferences that I've ever been to, but some of them actually were my students who were also going there as graduate students for the first time. But I did do that with a few. We went to Nijmegen to hear a couple of them. I don't know if they're listening at all up to this. We went to a Skillebek's conference after he had died. And so the whole vocation of a theologian in terms of mentoring, I think, is really important. And that isn't about, I don't think that is self-indulgent. I don't know how good a mentor I have been. I mean, anybody that was one of my students said, well, you're one yourself, Julia, you can
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah.
But anyway, that has been one of the most gratifying things about being a theologian. And the thing that I regret most, though, is that in the process of not just teaching that book, my Madeleva Lecture, is the thing that comes up with regard to women who feel called to ordained ministry in the Catholic Church in particular, especially when we have Lutheran women who are pastors and Episcopal women pastors and even bishops, as we just saw in our inaugural announcement of Bishop Buddy. And so I had several students who became Episcopalians, mainly so that they could be responding to their call to be an ordained minister, and that's just still something that it disappoints me. It sometimes makes me angry. And again, I've had students say, "Well, why do you stay in the Catholic Church?" Now I said, "Well, I'm in a religious community, and that's probably what keeps me most." But and I am greatly we'll see what the future brings, but I'm greatly enamored of the whole concept of synodality. And Pope Francis, who isn't going to live forever and who knows what comes after him. So the whole kind of hierarchical structure is a problematic thing with regard to ministry in the Catholic Church. But anyway, those are just some thoughts. They're not really, I hope, about being self-indulgent as they are about being concerned, basically.
I'd like to pick up on that if I could, because you mentioned sort of imposter syndrome, Marianne, a couple of minutes ago, and I remember that when I went to a women's college and I had all these really well-educated nuns teaching me, who inspired me to go to graduate school. But I just remember when I was in graduate school myself, and there were not a lot of women in the late 70s studying theology. I remember that when I took my exams, one of the professors was saying, "Isn't this wonderful? There are 3 women taking exams." But I think that I always had this sense that the more abstract I was, the smarter I was. And so my interest in the way in which we come to God and come to understanding religion, not just in abstract ideas, but in the sacraments, for example, and in physical ways in which we have these experiences. I think it seemed to some of my fellow students kind of soft, that this was something that wasn't as sort of hard-edged as theology ought to be. And so that when I began working on my dissertation, I remember, reading about how Balthasar's critique of theology was that it was overly rationalistic. And I remember thinking at the time, yeah, I think so too. But it was still seen as something kind of soft and feminine, at least by some people. And so, it was kind of interesting when I have to say in writing the Madeleva Lecture, which I have to say when I wrote it, I loved doing it. It felt like so much fun. It was bringing all kinds of things together, where so much writing of theology, and I think all of us have experienced this, can be a little bit of nose to the grindstone, and I've got to get this out and I've got to get it done. But the way of that this style of doing theology could also be beautiful. And so I've always kind of been sensitive with my students, that I want them to be able to write in a way that's accessible, that people can understand, and that is not something that is seen as simply very dry. And so the understanding of imposter syndrome, I think, too, I felt a little bit like I was not, I don't know, I won't say not as smart as the other men, because I knew I was, but that I was taking a somewhat different path, doing theology through an aesthetic kind of dimension, which I think for some people did not seem quite as serious as hard philosophical theology. And so that was, and I think that sense of imposter syndrome kind of runs its way through a lot of us. But it also, I think, coming at theology from a slightly different angle, from the aesthetic angle, from looking at beauty, can also be very empowering.
You know, I was just thinking in terms of what you just said. I think there has been a lot of change in my experience, though, among graduate students that I've been teaching, with not feeling so much that they want to be cerebral and abstract and all of that. And I think that there's a wonderful interest in contemplative studies and contemplative approaches to theology that I have noted and I really appreciate for one thing. And it's something that I also think that the Spirituality Center at St. Mary's has done. I was especially grateful to Keith Egan, for example. For many years, he had these Carmelite seminars at St. Mary's campus, which I used to come and kind of make my retreat. And I was actually, I had somebody pay my way once, and it was Joanne Welsky-Cotton, another theologian. So I think that there are, some of that now is changing. And I think that actually the more experientially based theologies help promote that.
Oh, I think you're right about that. I think that has changed a lot, and I'm glad to see some of those changes.
But I still do think that, at least from some of my colleagues, that there's a critique about what you call this softness or stuff, but it's not among students so much, including the male students as well. So I think, you know, it's a generational maybe kind of change that's happening.
Were you going to say something, Dr. Mandell, about
Well,
this?
just building on your conversation, I was reminded of Sister Madeleva's book of essays on women's education, ironically titled Conversations with Cassandra, who was the prophetess telling the truth and nobody believed her. That was the curse. And so Madeleva has all these wonderful essays, and one of them is about the education of women in an age when every institution was going co-ed that was female, and or many were. And St. Mary's was in later, after Madeleva's death, where was in that situation on at the altar with the University of Notre Dame, and then both sides withdrew. But her point was, women who opt for an education designed by and for men are like Sabine women. They're carried off from their native land, and they're in a strange land thereafter, in which they're trying to fit into something that is not made for them, is not tailored for them. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in what she says about that, because the students I have taught at a young age of 18 through 22, for the most part, are still in a change of rapid change and self-definition. And it's very hard to not to be defined by a curriculum that still is dominated by dead white males, if you're really honest.
Well, it's interesting too that so I wrote an article not a few years back about that when Mundelein College became a part of Loyola University, there was a real clash of styles. And so there was this one building of Mundelein that was really, it's an old mansion, and when it was redone, it was just done so beautifully with really an eye to the aesthetics. And that when another one of the Mundelein buildings was taken over by another department. It was sort of all hard edges and stainless steel, and so it was kind of interesting to see the formerly women's college that was so sensitive to the aesthetics, and actually the main building was designed with very specific attention to the materials that it was put together with and all of that, the president of Mundelein College at the time felt that it was really important to emphasize the aesthetic, because the young women that were coming there were coming from all parts of the city, mostly as day students, and she thought that they deserved to be surrounded by beauty, that it was really important for them. So it's, and then when they redid the library for Mundelein College, which became part of Loyola, it was all hard edges and stainless steel, and it was just kind of interesting, the contrast in styles, that one of them, it just seemed to have that, to be really serious, you have to have the hard edges, but yet with Mundelein College, the whole idea was that you really want to inspire your students to be in a beautiful situation so that they can communicate all of this, in their own studies and in their own lives.
All three of you in some ways in your lectures, I think, play with this kind of expectations about what women should be like, but also upend those expectations in certain ways. And so I'm curious about the ways in which some of the ideas that we bring to what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a religious, what it means to be intelligent, what it means to be a serious academic, have been subjects that you have tried to expand and open up in your own work.
Well, I'll just say that going to a women's college, and it was a sister school of yours, Susan. I went to Maryville College of the Sacred Heart, run by the Madeleva Sacred Heart in St. Louis, and you said you went to Manhattanville.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a wonderful education by women, and that experience opened me very early to that gender is too simplified when you just say female and male, that we had the whole spectrum of human sexuality, gender in my classes with my friends, some very, very Barbie-like figures, and some, on the other hand, the jocks. And I mean, it was the whole range of sexuality. And I was really opened up to that by single-sex education. I don't know that I would have realized that otherwise. And I came to respect those differences and understand those differences. And I just, I don't know where to go with that, but I just want to say, I just think we need to maybe be more mindful and aware of what's around us and not think in stereotypes and try to cast people in the labels and the roles that we think of.
Amen.
Well,
Amen.
yeah. So when I was in high school, it was during Vatican II, and I remember that the books that we were given, we were reading Teilhard de Chardin, we were reading the documents of Vatican II, we were reading all of this stuff, and the nuns that I had very high expectations of all of us as students, and so that the way in which we were expected to be was the sky was the limit in that sense. And so there was that diversity, but there were also these wonderful role models that we had that basically said, you can go out there and you can do anything. And this is in the 60s.
Yeah. Oh, that's my experience as well. I went to an all-girls high school and an all women's college for the first 2 years, and then it went co-educational.
Right.
Although I have to say, I think this majority of students were women, and certainly the faculty was mostly women. But this idea that creativity and doing things that had never been done before, the encouragement of it in the science classes, and not only just the humanities, I felt really supported. And also I was in high school during Vatican II, and we were encouraged to go down to McCormick Place, I was in Chicago, and hear these expert theologians who were coming on these lecture tours in the United States, who were at Vatican II, and that's where I first heard Hans Küng, and who would ever have known at that time, kind of as little did I know, I ended up writing a dissertation on him, and having met him and studied with him actually in Tübingen too. So, and the other thing that I bring away is that one of our sisters, who ended up after she left the high school, being the head of the religious education for the Archdiocese of Chicago, she had us ordered for us a class subscription to the National Catholic Reporter, which had just started to publish. I think it's like 60 years, old now. And not, I used to think we had these little kind of Catholic messenger type things in grade school, but in high school. And so we were considered to be sort of, the idea would be to be educated Catholics, and also the emphasis on Catholic social teaching, which was very, very important in all of my education, I think. I regret right now, though, as I look back over my own Madeleva lecture, I was looking at what were the struggles and things like that. And there was something there, I can't remember exactly where it was right now. Oh, I know. I was quoting Mary Jo Weaver, the historian from Indiana University, who I'm sure is now retired, about why do you stay in the church, was one of her quotes. And she wrote a little book called Springs of Water in a Dry Land. And she said the choice to stay or leave the church for many women, including herself, was a choice between torture or starvation. Now, my regret is I don't think I'd have too many students today who would say that, particularly at the undergraduate level, because the church seems so out of touch and irrelevant to so many. So that's kind of a regret about are women shaping theology in a way, that can do much about that. But I do think, since most of the theologians that I know today are actually married and have children, who knows? But I know that they worry about this.
Yeah, well, I think that the whole idea of women doing theology, at least, and Mary and I were sort of a similar generation, is that after Vatican II, for me, it was like, oh, wow, this is something I can do. How exciting. I want to go do it. And so, and the idea of doing theology from a feminist perspective was something that I didn't really think of at first. I remember one time when I was first at graduate school, and there was a group of women that got together, and these older graduate students that I sort of looked up to, and I remember that I went to this group and I said something like, yeah, all this stuff on women is kind of interesting, but I really want to do systematic theology. And now I look back on that sort of with embarrassment and have to say, because I remember they looked at me kind of kindly and like, she doesn't really get it yet. But I did eventually get it, because actually it was the late wonderful Ann Patrick passed on to me Mary Daly's book, Gynecology, when I was a graduate student to write a review of it. And I have to say, in reading that book, so I think all of us have read that book at one point or another, I really felt as if my head had been taken off my shoulders and shaken up and put back on, and I never saw the world quite in the same way again. So that opportunity then, that was, the opportunity to do that and learn from the women who had preceded us, was very, very, very exciting. But I do kind of look back on some of the things that I said, before my consciousness was raised, I guess I would say, because that was the kind of culture that I was raised in, even though the nuns that I had in high school and college were brilliant. And as I said, had us reading people like Teilhard de Chardin and the documents of Vatican II. Still, I think for a lot of women, that development of an awareness of how women, in the title of your book, Marian, Women Shaping Theology, meant that, say, my interest, say, in the aesthetic dimension, is a way of women shaping theology, where I needed to break out of the idea that I had to do theology the way that my male fellow graduate students were doing it.
I think one of the things that's been really powerful for me in reviewing so many of the Madeleva lectures is it's been really moving to me how much things have changed in 40 years even. I mean, Dr. Hinsdale, I don't know if you know the statistics on this, but you mentioned in your Madeleva lecture that in CTSA at 2003, less than 30% of CTSA members were women at the time. I don't know what the statistics are now. I don't know if you do, but I know the current president is a woman. We have 2 women here who have been president. Right now, the current president is a woman, the president-elect is a woman, the vice president is a woman, and the past president, most recent past president. So all 4 are women. So women's leadership in the guild has been really important. There have been some real movements in over 40 years that have been really meaningful and have paved the way for folks like me and folks like our students who are much younger, obviously.
Of course, sometimes I look back, I was a secretary besides being a president, and so I had all that statistics at my disposal, to be able to count. And the thing that was true is that the women showed up at the convention, so it looked like it was almost 50-50. But also the women are willing to do the work of being elected to these positions, and they are a lot of work. True. And often during the years when Susan and I were involved in that, of course, we had every year we were going to say, like, okay, who's going to be called before the, CDF or the whatever they call it now, the ICD. I don't know. There's got another initial in front of it right now, or the bishops or something like that for something that was written, and we'd have to support them and all that. But I do think, in fact, that is how I ended my Madeleva lecture was with a poem from the famous poem from
Mary Oliver.
Mary Oliver, yeah. On a summer's day, what are you going to do with your one precious life? And I said, in the end, with whatever else may be true about the church, well, be a theologian. You can do, something. That's a vocation, and that's really important. So I do think we've seen a big swing. I don't know the statistics right now of the numbers, but as you pointed out, Susan or Julia, that our current leadership in that professional organization is mostly women.
Yeah.
I don't know if we still have time, but I would just point out that when Sister Madeleva founded the School of Sacred Theology, which was really the first offer of full-time studies and graduate degrees in theology to women and laymen, she said that you give women a start, and it may be all male instructors, which it was, Jesuits and Dominican priests, but soon the women will take advantage of that education and move out. And they were teaching the religion courses in many colleges, certainly in high schools around the country. And it really did change the face of theology. And
Mhm.
Mary Daly herself was one of the first graduates of the School of
Right.
Sacred
That's right.
Theology.
Good
And
reminder,
I
Yep.
know
Jan.
that she owned it. She kept, I don't know if she was embarrassed by the fact that it was a women's institution. Shame on her if so, but she got her degree there.
That always floors people, students, when I get up
Yeah.
with class. But there is something in the chat there. A question is being asked, Julie. I don't know if we have time to look at it. I actually know the person who's asking it, but maybe it
Yeah,
may be too much.
I think that we have touched on some of the ideas that folks have offered. So I think what is left to be said is to thank the three of you for a really wonderful conversation. I'm really, really enriched by this beautiful conversation about beauty, and what counts as indulgent and what doesn't, and what counts as feminine and what counts as intelligent. So I'm really, all three of you are a great gift to me. So thank you to everyone for who has participated, who has watched, and we are really grateful, as Professor Horan mentioned at the beginning, to Keith Egan for really getting this whole thing going.
Oh,
We
definitely.
honor him
Yeah. Mhm.
tonight. Thank you so much.
Good.
Good evening to everyone.
Thanks for
Thanks
bringing us
all of you,
together.
too. Yes, and thanks, Julia.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Good night.